So thanks very much everyone for joining. I'll be talking you through today the EDI toolkit. So we've developed this with Shift Design, and it came from a piece of work that was started by Big Issue Invest and UnLtd, and as part and also in conjunction with the Growth Impact Fund. And they sort of started off with doing a lot of research around equity, diversity, and inclusion, and different ways of collecting diversity data. And after doing kind of a massive literature review, within the Growth Impact Fund, they had developed this tool, which is the EDI Toolkit, the first version, which they were working with social enterprises to complete the tool, and it was taking around 2 hours to kind of go through all of the different categories that they designed, and then assign organisations a level that they can then reflect on and continue to work to make progress on. They then wanted to kind of adapt this tool for use with social investors, which is where Shift Design began working with the Diversity Forum. And over the last couple of months, we've kind of organised the sections that were in the previous version of the EDI toolkit to align them with the principles of the manifesto. And our intention is for the EDI toolkit to be used as a way for social investors who've signed up to the manifesto to reflect on their annual goals and potentially use the tool to set their annual targets. So all of the information is available on our website and also the UnLtd website, but I'll just share screen and go through it all together. So if can you all see my screen? Okay. So if you go to our website under manifesto, you'll see the EDI toolkit. And on this page, you can see kind of the 4 steps of using the EDI toolkit. So hopefully all of the organisations have signed the manifesto, but that's kind of the pre-step. And then after that, we encourage you to organise a team. So that could be an existing EDI working group, or it could be a new team specifically around prioritising equity, diversity, and inclusion in your organisation. Step 2 is working through the self-assessment, which is the form that I'll show you shortly. From there, you then create kind of an action plan to address all the areas within the form that you feel like you could progress further or that you've not yet started. And then hopefully that will lead to better equity, diversity, and inclusion in your organisation. And then with the team, you kind of monitor and continue to go through this process in an iterative fashion. We have a number of different resources that kind of support this. So I'll talk you through, to begin with, this is the toolkit. So it's a really simple toolkit, and it just takes you through all of those steps that I just shared in a really simple fashion. So like I said, these are the kind of steps that we suggest. So signing the manifesto, the team, the self-assessment, the action plan, and then continuing to work with the Diversity Forum to kind of reiterate the whole process again. With step 1, so assembling a team, we have some suggestions just from best practice, given our experience of kind of the last 2 years of the manifesto, and also kind of anecdotally from our champions as well about what works well. So we suggest building buy-in at board level and also senior management team levels, just because that helps work progress a lot faster. It prevents kind of any sort of unexpected delays, but also as a priority for your organisation, it means that often that you get more resource and capacity for it as well. We suggest that the EDI working group kind of be as diverse across the organisation as possible. So best practice that we're suggesting is to have one person responsible for internal EDI practice, which might look like your recruitment processes or your culture internally, or the environment if you have a physical workplace or even a digital workplace. But also having one person responsible for external EDI practice. So that's kind of knowledge and oversight of your investment policies, who you're funding, who you're not funding, whether or not you're collecting data on that, and whether or not you're then implementing that data to make change. One person from your senior management team, and also facilitator or guide to facilitate the team sessions. We also suggest as an option having an investee or customer with experience of applying to your funds, preferably from a minoritized or underrepresented background, who is also compensated for their time. As good practice, it would be good to have someone from some organizations, for example, have like whole customer advisory boards. But including them in your EDI working group can just really help with like power shift in terms of redistribution of power, but also kind of listening to the main audience when you're implementing changes to EDI in your organization. So this is obviously step one, setting up a team, and that can take different amounts of time depending on your organization and where you already are with that. And then step two is clarifying the commitments of your EDI working group. So no, sorry, this is part of step one. So part of step one is just clarifying commitments. So as bare minimum, we suggest 2 hours to go through the form, which is the EDI Toolkit, and then another 2 hours to then reflect on your answers from the form to create an action plan for the following year. In addition to that, we'd suggest at least as a minimum quarterly meetings to reflect on progress that you've made according to your annual targets. And that amount of time might be different for each person, depending on the level of roles and responsibilities, but also the capacity that they have to work on EDI. There's a draft email here that you can use, and we'd encourage you to invite as many colleagues as you can from as many departments as you can, and to kind of maintain building that working relationship. Step two then is the self-assessment itself. So we have created a Google form which is available on our website, which you can use. We suggest having a 2-hour session to complete this self-assessment tool. You can do it in person or you can do it online. Before you kind of get involved, we suggest reading through the Diversity Forum manifesto to just familiarise yourself with the principles and kind of what we've written under each one and your understanding of that. And within the self-assessment itself, you'll be asked 17 yes or no questions about your current EDI activity in relation to the first 6 principles of the manifesto. So that's really deliberate, just because the 7th principle of the manifesto is about advocacy. And we decided that actually advocacy could look very different for every organisation. So that's kind of within kind of annual reporting for the Diversity Forum, we'll be asking organisations to reflect on their advocacy independently, depending on what you have or haven't done or are planning to do. But with the other principles, we felt there were sort of kind of minimum criteria that every organisation could definitely get started on. And hopefully this EDI toolkit will help organisations to reflect on that. After each question, so depending on whether you say yes or no, you'll then be asked about additional EDI activity or EDI gaps at your organisation. And finally, you'll be asked to rate the maturity of your EDI practice for 6 out of the 17 questions, so for the principles. And then at the end of the session, we encourage you to then do like a bit of a checkout with your working group about what has surprised you about the self-assessment, or is there anything that's worth mentioning that wasn't covered. So again, even though like a lot of research and a lot of different organizations have worked together to form this EDI toolkit, it's not comprehensive. And there are probably almost definitely things that we've missed that you might already be doing or that you might have seen others do. So we really encourage you to use the toolkit in kind of a critical way and to feedback to us directly at the Diversity Forum to make changes, but also within your EDI working group, just to challenge yourself to think what could be missing from this, what could be additional. So I'll just pause for a second there and go into the form itself. So this is kind of the back end of the form so that you can see how it all works. So it starts off with like a nice introduction page, and we ask for your email just so that we can communicate with you directly, but also so that at the end, all of your responses will then be emailed to you automatically. as you go through, we start off by asking who's completing your EDI self-assessment. So that's who's leading the EDI working group. We're interested in that just to kind of better target our support as the diversity forum. And so that won't reflect on you in any way. It's just kind of for our own learning. And then we'll ask for the name of your organisation. And then each principle basically starts with a reminder of what that principle is. So principle 1 is around organisational commitment, and the principle is we take ownership of our commitment to equity, equality, diversity, and inclusion. And then we've got a little accessibility piece here, which says the 3 questions relating to this principle, and there are a different number of questions for each section. So for this question, we ask around an EDI statement, EDI targets, and EDI policies. Within each of these subcategories, we start off with a yes or no question, and then the logic within the form is automatic. So depending on whether or not you answer yes or no, you'll then be asked an additional set of questions. So I'll give question 1 as an example. So the first yes or no question is, have you committed to equity, diversity, and inclusion in your organisation's mission, vision, values, or elsewhere? If you feel like that's a solid yes, tick yes. If that's not something that you think is clear, tick no. Again, this is for your own self-reflection as an organisation. So we'd encourage you to be as honest as possible. And then after you tick yes or no, we'll then ask kind of further in-depth questions to see how far you've gone with that. So for this one, in terms of having a statement is good practice, but how far have you gone with that? So does your statement, for example, acknowledge previous mistakes? Does your statement acknowledge your appetite for risk? Or does it not mention either of this? Or have you reflected on those things internally? And then if you've answered no, we'll then ask you follow-up questions. So for example, in this case, if you've answered no, we ask you, is EDI a priority for your organisation? And that's where you might say yes, but we've not got a written statement yet, or no. I won't go through all the questions, but just as an example, that's basically the logic of how you kind of work through the toolkit. And as I said, once you've gone through the whole self-assessment in that 2-hour session, you'll then get emailed back the responses. And that's session 1. And then after that, what we encourage you to do is then have another session. So session 2 is another 2-hour EDI action planning session. And that is hopefully a time where you can come together with your working group, maybe a week later or a month later, and then review all of your responses to the 17 self-assessment questions and highlight the ones that you answered no to. So they'll be the areas that we suggest that you then use to create targets for improvement. And we suggest working together to do that with somebody appointed as a facilitator, to kind of replay each question and gather the group together to set those new targets and who's going to be responsible for achieving those targets and in what time frame. What we also suggest that you do within the session is for the areas that you've chosen, so the areas that you want to prioritise, asking the group what does better or best EDI practice look like for your organisation. So that's asking kind of both what is best EDI practice within this principle, but also kind of contextualising it for your specific organisation and what's realistic and kind of within your resource and capacity. Once you've agreed those goals, we suggest adding a deadline and assigning the lead, and then afterwards scheduling the follow-up meetings with the working groups to kind of track that progress throughout the year. For accountability, we'd really encourage you to share the outcome of this session with the Diversity Forum, and then we can check in with you when it comes to your annual monitoring, to be just to share back with you, these are the goals that you set a year ago and how are you doing with those goals. To help with that, we've also created an EDI Toolkit manifesto action plan. So this is just a Word document that each organisation can download, and it's also available on our website. And it basically just has the subheadings under each question, under each principle, sorry. So as you can see, under principle 1, you have the EDI statement, the EDI targets, and the EDI policies. And then from the self-assessment, you can kind of fill in, these are the targets that we'd like to work on. So for example, if you have a written statement, but you haven't reflected on your own mistakes, maybe that's the next level for you as an organization. So that could be a target with an assigned lead and then the timeline. And we've got that for every single principle, and all of the sections in the self-assessment are on this action plan. If again, this is kind of deliberately kind of open. So if there are things here that you want to add that are specific to your organization or your existing EDI plans, we'd really encourage you to just kind of add in another area under collaboration and production, and maybe add in something around your EDI working group internally and promoting that practice, for example, or anything that we've not covered. So again, we encourage you to use these tools in as flexible a way as possible, because they're tools, and they're not designed to be perfect. So going back to the guide, so after so you set up your group, you've done session 1, which is the self-assessment, and then session 2, which is the EDI action planning. And then here's a template that I just shared with you that you can use to carry on to kind of formalize that planning. After that, we'd encourage you to then share those with us, and then also annually we'll ask for kind of reporting on that. Just to reflect from like a diversity forum perspective, we've come to the end of our first year of the manifesto, and this is partly in recognition that not all of the organisations who had signed the manifesto had completed the reporting. So what we're hoping is that the EDI Toolkit will make that annual reporting process a little bit more clearer, and easier to kind of facilitate in your respective organisations. What we'll also be doing is kind of emailing out to every signatory to ask if you want to use this reporting to kind of reset your annual reporting dates, or if you're happy to kind of continue with your current annual reporting dates. But hopefully this can kind of form as a baseline for annual EDI reporting, and then we'll encourage kind of self-reflection and additional forms of EDI reporting in addition to that. As I said, under principle 7, so the principle around advocacy, there's a big kind of focus around that, and that kind of independent self-led EDI work. The last thing that I was just going to share with you is just a bit about maturity within the EDI self-assessment. So excuse me. So just going back to the self-assessment tool here, so at the very end, after you've kind of been through all of the principles, there is a matrix which looks like this, and this asks you to kind of indicate the maturity of your EDI practice across the following, and we have certain categories that are applicable under each of the principles listed out here, so you can't see it all. But what we have under each of the headings is whether or not you've allocated resource to this, whether or not you're reviewing this regularly, whether or not you're acting on this review. And this is really just to kind of help, again, kind of instigate those conversations around what is the next step. So if, for example, around recruitment, you've allocated resource, you've kind of done the initial review of your recruitment and you're working on it, the next step might be to integrate this into your practice as something that you regularly review and monitor, and make sure that that's kind of that is adequately resourced and planned for on a yearly or 2-yearly or 3-yearly basis. So yeah, just to kind of draw your attention to that as part of the self-assessment, as well as going through each of the principles and kind of the baseline. Hopefully this will also cover the depth of your EDI work. Sorry, that was quite a lot of conversation from me, and stop the recording, and then if people feel comfortable to, I'd really encourage you to unmute and kind of share any reflections or any questions around